Okay, good afternoon. On behalf of the Criminal Justice Program of Study, Research, and Advocacy, welcome to our conference on criminal justice and the media. I want to say a word or two, before we start off the conference, I want to say a word or two about our program, which is a new program. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge something that has happened on the campus today that has preoccupied the campus. I think it explains why we don't have more students here, because many students are discussing this topic and concerned about it. Last night, there was a defacing of faculty portraits in the WCC building of the black faculty here at the Harvard Law School. Their portraits were defaced with a tape. It's obviously a horrible, outrageous act of vandalism, and it has caused an enormous amount of upset and reaction across the campus, among the students, and of course among the faculty and the administration. And we had a meeting at noontime about it, but the discussions are continuing about how to respond. Obviously, there have been statements from the school and from faculty denouncing this act, but it's raised a lot of larger issues. So we wanted, since our criminal justice program obviously deals with a lot of issues of race, so they're not separate from the issues that are at play, we wanted to acknowledge that and express our outrage, obviously, and sympathy for the students. The Criminal Justice Program of Study, Research, and Advocacy, Alex Whiting, I'm one of the faculty co-directors. Carol Steiker is the other faculty co-director. Larry Schwartzstall is the executive director of the program. The program started this year, and it is a new program at the law school that is aimed to bring together faculty and students from a range of perspectives, prosecution, defense, NGOs, to work on criminal justice issues. And we have a group of students who are working on issues, partnering with outside organizations on issues like bail reform, police body cameras, fees and fines, private probation, and we're continuing to add projects to the program. We have also held a number of speaker events during the term, including a speaker series on criminal justice and race in Baltimore. And this is our first major conference. We will be holding one major conference each semester. Professor Steiker will tell a little bit more about that, about this conference and about conference next term. And we're very excited about the program. We've been very busy doing a lot of work and getting a lot of attention, and we are continuing to grow the program and look forward to more events in the future. So thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. So now to introduce the conference and the program, Professor Steiker.
Thank you, Alex. The impetus for this conference has come from the twin phenomenon of a quickly changing media landscape and also a quickly changing landscape of criminal justice policy. We're at the first moment of inflection in criminal justice policy really in a couple of generations. At the same time that the media has been supplemented and challenged by a profusion of new kinds of media, citizen journalism, ground-up journalism, and digital media and podcasts, the portrayal of the criminal justice system in the media has radically changed. So we've moved from a kind of it leads Metro Desk reporting on criminal justice to a more kind of above the fold, to use a print journalism metaphor, above the fold, sustained attention to and critique of current criminal justice institutions. So the questions for this conference that we'd like to address are how the change in public discourse has come about, what brought it about, and how the media is currently shaping the debate in criminal justice. And we want to do this warts and all. We want to talk about the media's role in current criminal justice debates for good and for ill. We want to talk about these new forms of citizen journalism and what they mean for the landscape of criminal justice coverage, and we want to know how media coverage can, does, should contribute to criminal justice reform, and how we could assess or measure that impact. So we have with us an extraordinary group of journalists and people from the media, lawyers and criminal justice policymakers today, this afternoon, and most of the day tomorrow to address these questions. As Alex Whiting, Professor Whiting, I'll call you Alex, we'll call everyone else by their first name. As Alex said, we will also be hosting another conference in the spring. Our conference in the spring will be on the new politics of criminal justice and the unusual convergence of left and right in certain areas on criminal justice reform, and what possibilities this increasing convergence suggests, but also what pitfalls and challenges it poses. And we want to think about these issues as we head into the 2016 election cycle and talk about what the changing political landscape and changing politics of criminal justice portend for that election and beyond. So if you guys would like to sit down, we will actually get started on our first panel, which is an extraordinary panel. You can, in the programs, which should be available, as ever I see them on people's, in front of people, you can read the bios of our really incredible panelists, the full bios in your program. So I'm not going to repeat them at length here. I'll just do a line or two that you can identify going down the line who these folks are. And then we're going to have a discussion that's not going to be the traditional panel discussion where we're not going to have a presentation, of 15 minutes going down the line. Instead, we're aiming for a kind of conversation. Q&A, I will be asking the questions, and they will be doing the answers. This is a kind of introduction for them to the Harvard Socratic method of the classroom.
It's a total power move, Carol.
Yes,
Thank
exactly.
you for that.
Well, Jim Johnson, who is in my law school class, is very familiar with the Harvard Law School Socratic method. But it's not just an interrogation. I encourage all of the panelists, if you hear a question posed to another panelist that you would like to speak to, I'm going to be facing you, so I'll be able to see, and we'll hopefully have a dynamic conversation rather than a seriatim presentation of views. So starting with Jim Johnson. Jim, aside from being most famous for being my college and law school classmate, is an attorney in private practice and also a member of the board of directors of the Brennan Center. Jim also served high up in the Department of Treasury during the Clinton administration, where he was charged with oversight of the ATF, the Secret Service, the U.S. Customs Service, among other federal law enforcement units. He's currently working with the Brennan Center with a highly influential group of law enforcement leaders to reduce crime and incarceration, and we're really pleased to have him. Bill Keller is the editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, which everyone I know who is interested in criminal justice reads religiously. He's also himself a former Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and executive editor of the New York Times. Heather McDonald, currently with the Manhattan Institute, is both a writer whose work has appeared in print and a frequent television commentator, and also a podcaster, I believe. So
isn't everybody?
Isn't everybody, right? And she's also a lawyer. So she's, sort of bridges the journalism-law divide, and she's a critic, and an influential critic, a forceful and influential critic of many left liberal positions on criminal justice reform. Brent Staples has spent the past quarter century on the New York Times editorial board, writing on a broad range of topics, including frequently on issues relating to criminal justice. He is one of the nation's most thoughtful commentators on race. Brent, it's great to have you back at Harvard after your very influential W.E.B. Du Bois lectures of I'm remembering about a decade ago. It's great to have you back here. Finally, Nick Turner currently serves as the president of the Vera Institute of Justice, the nation's most influential and respected criminal justice think tank. Like Heather, Nick is both a lawyer and a writer. of articles and op-eds on criminal justice. So this is a fantastic panel, and we are thrilled and very lucky to have you here. So, for our first topic, I think we just want to try to understand this moment that we're in, a moment, I called it an inflection point, a real moment of questioning our institutions of criminal justice. Bill, can I start with you? In the last year and a half, there's been an explosion of criminal justice coverage in various forms of media, including print, broadcast, online, documentary, film, and of course, podcasts. Why has this occurred?
My wife has instructed me that when I get that question, I'm always supposed to say, it's no coincidence that just a year ago, the Marshall Project launched.
We could expect
and suddenly it's everywhere. We may have had some small stimulus effect on the coverage, but it's a combination of things, I think. One of them is news events. This is sort of the real Ferguson effect. I mean, Ferguson and a series of other encounters between police and the people they're supposed to serve and protect, I think forced at least some issues of how the criminal justice system works onto the agenda. I would give considerable credit to the fact that there is now not huge, but significant common ground between right and left. And whenever there's, particularly these days, when you detect a bit of bipartisanship in Washington, it's like finding a unicorn. So that got a lot of attention. I'm not sure people really understood both the extent and the limits of that and the deep roots of it. But it got discovered this year, I think, and that brought a lot of attention to it. And to some extent, I think it's, we have a generation that has grown up with relatively quite low crime rates, without the crack panic, without the sort of Willie Horton era, meaning the millennials. And on a lot of campuses, students have begun to put criminal justice on their list of sort of social justice issues. That's probably helped too. I'm sure there are other factors.
I would say that even before the intervention of the Ferguson effect and the various unjustified shootings of civilians, like the one in South Carolina, even before that, a current of thought had been moving. And as an editorial writer over a long period of time, I've had a chance to try out different strategies writing about criminal justice. And initially I was writing about sort of values issues and international comparisons and how the United States had 14 times the incarceration rate of China or Germany, or I'd write about how people in foreign countries actually vote from prison. And I was talking about trying to embarrass the country into thinking it was not really in the vanguard of democracy, and that went absolutely nowhere. Those editorials fell flat, and you could see that from the letters. But what happened in the mid-decade, I started to write about money. I started to say, this is costing the country, say, depending on how you count it, $60, $70 billion a year. And in some states, it's replacing roads, schools, all kinds of other things that the state is trying to do. And by 2007, and that's about 2006, 2007, 2009, that argument was getting a huge traction. And when I say traction, I mean New York Times is known in some circles as a liberal paper. But my editorials were being seen on bulletin boards and on websites in the Texas legislature, Republicans, in Kansas, in really sort of hardcore law and order places. The notion that that locking up more people than we needed to for public safety was costing us more than was sustainable by that period of time took off. And we were able to hang a lot of other things on that. We're able to go into Texas and say, you are basically expelling or jailing black kids at 5 times the rate of white kids for the same offenses. And we're able to sort of Christmas tree that effect. But in my view, I think from where I was sitting, the trigger was the economic argument. And Republicans, in those states really paid attention to that. So that moved the argument a lot. And there's a group called the Council of State Governments, and you all might know them. They do a lot of research. They have a justice center. They go into states, and the states are saying, why are so many people coming back to jail? What is it costing us? We'd rather do something else with that money. And so they basically do an analysis of it, and typically what they found was that 60% or more of persons who were returning to jail were returning to jail for technical violations, i.e. dirty urine, i.e. not showing up for an appointment, i.e. some ancillary thing that was actually not a new freestanding crime in and of itself. So in the states and in Congress, that argument was really moving. And they were saying, how can we save money? How can we keep people out of jail? How can we reduce the prison population? And in Texas, they got down to the point where, a few years ago, I think they took $1.5 billion off the budget just by reducing the reincarceration rate. So I think money set it up. And then, we had some spectacular events recently, but the argument was moving, and the consciousness of the country was moving prior to those.
You'd push the date back a little bit there.
Yeah, I would say that, actually, bless his heart, I would give some credit, too, to George W. Bush for the Second Chance Act, which was signed in 2002, which was supposed to give money to people to help them find housing, help them find jobs, help them find drug treatment, to keep people. It was an anti-recidivism bill, and it was never fully funded. But the fact that it was actually passed and signed it set up some apparatus in the Justice Department to give grants and so forth and so on. It gave a signal to the states that this should be a priority for you, too. So I would take it back there, and the march forward, and the sudden awareness in the states of how much money they were spending. Compounded on top of that, in 2009, the federal courts told California, you're at 190% capacity, you got to get it down to 114%, something like that. And so basically, several reforms there, the largest prison system in the country. So you had California sitting out there under sort of bench order. And that sort of helped bring the argument together. We had an editorial about this yesterday.
So, I think both Bill and Brent are right. I think they're also talking about slightly different things. So Brent just talked about what I think was largely a subterranean movement towards justice reform, seen in Texas, recognized in the Second Chance Act, things of that nature. Bill actually wrote about this in his New Yorker piece about the right, tracing back to the work of Pat Nolan really in the early aughts, and this movement was building. So I think that's one thing, but I think the question that you're asking is about this. Frenzied is the wrong word, but the intense level of media attention on this issue and why it's happening. And Bill's wife is right, I think, in part, that you have to look at sort of these catalytic examples of new journalism enterprises, so the Marshall Project. But there's, I don't think we can point to a moment in history where you have a set of journalists, I don't know how many you have on staff, 20 or so, who are devoted entirely to the matter of criminal justice, who are aggregating all of that content, who are sending it out on a daily basis for people who are interested in it, and that creates in it of itself the way the way information flows today. As a cycle of information transformation and sort of I don't know if it's an echo chamber, but a story comes out, you tweet it to a bunch of people who are reporters on that list. who run nonprofits who then react to that issue, and then it's sort of off and running, and it builds and it builds. And I think, relating to what Brent said, I mean, there have been obviously a bunch of remarkable moments that have captured Americans' attention in the last 12 to 18 months. Whether it's the, man bites dog story of the right and left, or whether it's South Carolina or Ferguson or Staten Island. But we're dealing with an inherently super interesting topic that is so deep and so complicated and affects so many people that it's largely unmined. And so I think we now have this journalistic infrastructure that has just been able to sort of dive deep into issues of mass incarceration and the effect on communities and the politics of it and the challenges of policing. And it's just sort of an endless, largely unexplored area. So you have a great hook, and there's now sort of infrastructure, whether it's the Marshall Project or whether it's all of these digital efforts like Vice, where they don't have to worry about a bottom line because they're getting a ton of VC money and private equity money, and they can just throw a lot of attention at things. And that generates a real interest. I'll tell you a really quick story just to give an example, which is that around 2002, 2003, I noticed when I was at Vera back then that this budget issue was something that was of great interest to state legislators. And I worked very hard to pitch the idea and help a reporter named Ellis Coase, who was then working at Newsweek, understand it. And took a few months, and then he wrote a pretty good piece that sort of captured this growing right-left interest in the fiscal impact of what we were doing. And it was this amazing hallelujah moment because it was a one-page substantive piece. And other than the sorts of things that Brent might write on occasion or like a few other lonely souls, you never saw anything like that at all. And now we're seeing content like that in droves on a daily basis. So flash forward to something, last summer, Vera organized a trip to Germany where we took a delegation, a governor and 4 corrections administrators and prosecutors and heads of right and left organizations to study prisons and the justice system there. And a reporter came along and did a daily digest of what we were seeing, and 60 Minutes sent a crew. And a piece will come out on that. And so the appetite is really remarkable. And the interesting question is how sustainable it is. Because I think it's different models of journalism that are at work here. Can the nonprofit journalistic models continue to succeed? Are they going to be sustainable? What happens to the Vices and the Fusions and the Voxes and all the other things which aren't having to deal with bottom line issues in the way that traditional journalism does? And that's sort of like the $1,000 question, I think.
I'd like to return to that in a little bit, the question of sustainability, both of the new media and of the new moment. But let's put that on hold for a second, because I want to dig a little deeper onto the how did this change happen? When did it happen? I want to turn to you, Jim, because you were high up in the Clinton administration in the 90s, mid-late 90s. Working at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. And now again, you're working with a very high level group of leaders in law enforcement. How has the conversation changed, and how did that change come about?
And I was a prosecutor before that, so I spent 11 years basically in federal law enforcement. And during the, so going from, I guess, the 90s into the aughts, it was very important. We were dealing with a crack epidemic, and as prosecutors, we were very, very aggressive in our prosecutions, and in certain areas we had absolutely zero tolerance. You had an appetite in the country at the time for much more aggressive prosecutions. During the Clinton years, the president put 100,000 cops on the street, a lot of them devoted to more community engagement, community policing efforts, but there are more cops that are on the street. And you had, as a matter of perspective, a president who was committed to the fact and the appearance of being very tough on crime. I attended many of his speeches, and one of the things he routinely said was, and I'm very proud of the fact that we have added more federal death penalties than any other presidency. And that was in some places where it was given an applause line. There was an appetite in the public for that. And so the discussions were largely in that sort of part of the spectrum. You roll the clock forward, and a number of things have happened. The crime rate has gone down, although the incarceration rates have more or less stayed the same. It is much more expensive, and we've had an economic downturn. We've had much more constrained state budgets, and folks are forced to be more intentional about what's going on. And you have two things going on within the law enforcement side. Well, I think three things going on. One, you have law enforcement that is saying, they've said this in small group meetings and large group meetings, we're not making people safer. It's costing a ton of money, and we need to move forward. You have many more people being subject to possible drug prosecution because the drug problems are moving out of the cities and into the suburbs. We haven't really talked about, why are people receptive to this, but there actually has been a shift in empathy. And although we are all
That's one way to put it.
right, seriously, but there is we are all more or less institutionalists. But the major stories around this have been catalyzed not by journalists getting to the scene and breaking the stories, but the fact that even, who knows what, if we say something particularly interesting, we could end up on YouTube right now. But you look at the Garner homicide in Staten Island. You look at the, and this is not casting a judgment on the grand jury's determination, that's what it was. You look at Ferguson, you look at the shooting in the Carolinas, front page stories where, and even a lot of what happened in Baltimore, the source of those is not the institutional media. The source is people on the street with their iPhones. And as a result, we get back to a truism, I think, in journalism, is if it bleeds, it leads. There is A, an appetite for that, and B, there's this sense that among many people, when they look at these videos, they say to themselves, this is not who we are. This is not the criminal justice system that, as we would expect it to be. And so there's that reaction as well, and all of those things come together to form this what some might call a perfect storm of media attention, but I think it's more than just attention.
Heather, you've heard your co-panelists talk about this, convergence of left and right. Do you agree that there's been a convergence? And if so, is it false consciousness on the right to converge with the left on some of the left's projects of criminal justice reform? I'd be interested to hear what your perspective on this convergence is.
Well, there's no question that prison is a squalid, depressing affair. And if there were alternatives to it that did as good a job of lowering crime by incapacitation, which is the blunt power that prison has, we should by all means institute them. So the search for alternatives is a completely valid and noble one. However, despite a phrase which is au courant now in the criminology profession of evidence-based practices, which is a term that allegedly refers to anti-recidivism programs, reentry programs that work, it is very hard to find community-based programs that can be replicated and brought to scale. The Justice Department has a whole website devoted to evidence-based practices. They have 6, in the whole country, they have 6 reentry programs listed. None of them it rates as effective. 4 are promising, 2 don't even work. So, well, again, I completely understand the impulse to find alternatives to incarceration. I think it's a little bit misleading to say that they're out there. I also, on the cost issue, I certainly agree with Brent that that has been the leading theme of groups like Right on Crime, led by Mark Levin out of Texas. I actually have argued that prison is a bargain. The last year for which there was a breakdown of state incarceration, criminal justice costs, that was 2010. The total state spending on incarceration was about $43 billion, but actual institutional spending, that is on prisons or jails, as opposed to community oversight or training, was about $37 billion. Federal spending is about $6 billion. So you get a total cost of about $43 billion nationally on institutional corrections. That number pales in comparison to what crime costs communities, both in terms of lost economic activity, businesses that are not willing to move into neighborhoods that are ravaged by the outdoor drug trade, psychological costs of people who feel like they're imprisoned in their own homes, even property crime, which is, you know, when you talk to prosecutors, it's a little disconcerting for the average citizen to hear the prosecutors' sort of great chain of being of crime, where property crimes are inevitably viewed as non-serious. So if you steal a car and there's nobody in it, that's a non-serious crime. You're not going to go to prison. If there's somebody in it and you're carjacking, you will, or if you use a weapon, you will. But even a street that is prey to car or house break-ins is a street living under thrall of crime. The HUD has one program alone, the Community Planning Development Grants, $88 billion. That's one HUD program to try and revive neighborhoods that have been decimated by crime. So I would, well, I'm certainly not going to impugn the good faith of the Newt Gingriches and the Koch brothers who have founded this left-right alliance. I think that I would disagree with some of their analyses. And I would also say, if I could, and I don't know if this is allowed in the Socratic method to bring up a second theme.
Be our guest.
Thank you. I would say that...
In law school, we would call it dodging, but...
Oh, dodging. Have I dodged, though?
Not yet.
This is a bonus point.
Not yet.
I would, at some point, I think the media has done a poor job of talking about criminal justice. I think the
Heather,
dominant...
actually, that is my
Okay.
next topic.
Okay,
so
great.
you're not dodging, but you're jumping ahead of the syllabus.
Reserve my time.
But I want to just, Jim, I want to ask you, because you're very involved with this group, Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration.
Yep.
So, you know, these are a group of, what, 100 plus?
130 so far.
130 law enforcement folks who think, so I want to hear what they're thinking is sort of contrary to Heather's, I think, well-presented idea that the best way to reduce crime is not to reduce incarceration, but they have a different agenda. Can you tell us a little bit about that and
Sure, let me get
how
into
you
that,
think
but
that's
I didn't, what I heard from Heather, and I don't want to mischaracterize you, is that she's looking at one answer, imprisonment, as sort of the leading edge of reducing crime. And my interest in the group, and this has been an interest, I mean, since I was in the Clinton administration, I was actually criticized for saying this in a congressional hearing. We were discussing different methods of solving gun crime. And my response to a senator's question was, actually it was a House member's question, was if the crime has already happened, to a certain extent we've already lost. And the worldview that Heather seemed to articulate was abandoned the front end, which is a lot of the focus of this group. So the group that was formed 3 weeks ago, announced 3 weeks ago, we've actually been working on this for more than a year, is largely self-descriptive. It's law enforcement leaders to reduce crime and reduce overuse of incarceration. The focus is, part of our work focuses on the front end. So we have 4 pillars, one of which is alternatives to use of incarceration. We means focusing on things like not just prison reform and sentencing reform, but actually bail reform. There are many people that are subjected to incarceration, and some of our members are actually county sheriffs who are jailers and who see these things, who really don't have any business being in jail. But when they are in jail, that means they're losing time potentially at work. They're losing the opportunity to do all sorts of things that Heather has identified that are important to community, the ability to work, the ability to be viable members of the community. Whether or not they're ultimately charged, they're lost. So we're focusing in part on that. We are focused on right-sizing penalties that are imposed. By that I mean this. If you were to steal, let's take hypothetically, that it was a felony to steal $600 or $500 worth of goods in 1968. In 2015, that $500 would get you a lot less than it would have gotten in 1967. And yet, both could be felonies. In 2015, you might get yourself a pair or 2 of sneakers, whereas if you did it in in 1968, you actually might get a junkie car, but a car. Very different. We're focused on the appropriate use of mandatory minimums rather than a sort of helter-skelter use of them, so that when I was a prosecutor, there were a wide variety of people that we prosecuted that under the sentencing guidelines, some of them would not have received 5 years in prison. But because of my charging decisions, and my charging decisions were, you charge the best, the most serious crime that was available to you, there were people who would end up going away for 5 years. It really, the law, without the mandatory minimums and the sentencing guideline recommendations without the mandatory minimums, wouldn't have put them as far away. And then our 4th piece is about community engagement. And for me, the community engagement is actually a more interesting and promising piece. I live in New Jersey and have been working with the chiefs of police and the NAACP and other civil rights groups to come together around enlisting community members and law enforcement in joint projects of rebuilding these communities, many of which have been devastated by crime. And what the NAACP conference president in New Jersey has said, we view this as collective responsibility. And you have many members of communities saying, one way for us to deal with these issues is to form new partnerships, new alliances with law enforcement, and have this, rather than impose by control from outside, begin sets of partnerships that will reduce the levels of crime that we're very much concerned about.
If I could just respond to Jim's excellent points. I was not focusing on incarceration because I think that that's the only or the best law enforcement or community tool, but just because that is one of the focal points of the left-right bridge, is to talk about incarceration. I'm by no means indifferent to front-end reduction, and I would say, in my experience, one of the most compelling demonstrations of a front-end reduction is a study that came out of the Brennan Center that Jim is involved with now, with Mr. Turner's predecessor, Michael Jacobson and James Austin, showing that in New York State, the prison population dropped considerably while the prison population in the rest of the country was still rising, even as arrests coming out of New York City were increasing. And their explanation was that New York Police Department, New York City, which is the big driver of the state prison population, was engaged in proactive quality of life enforcement. They were engaged in misdemeanor enforcement that was averting more serious felony crimes. So felony arrests and felonies were dropping, misdemeanor arrests were going up, and yet both the Rikers Island jail population was dropping and the prison population was dropping because policing was actually bringing a level of order to communities that was not present before. And I would add to that mix reasonable suspicion stops, which I think are also a very powerful way when done legitimately, and obviously they have to be done with full constitutional grounding and reasonable suspicion, are another way of interfering in criminal behavior before it ripens into a felony, which is going to possibly, but only rarely, end you up in prison. Because, in fact, prison remains today what it always has been, which is a lifetime achievement award for persistence in criminal offending. You have to work very hard to get yourself into prison.
Well, Heather, I want to raise the question with the panel that you wanted to get to just a moment ago, which is, turning the focus back to the media. What is it that media outlets are getting right about the criminal justice system, and what are they getting wrong? I want to come back to you, Heather, but I'm going to start with someone else. So, Nick, how about you? Can you tell us, what you think the media is getting right or getting wrong? Is more media attention always better for criminal justice reform, or are there downsides to it?
It's hard to treat the media as a monolith. So let me come to that in a second. But let me also just say, I appreciate Heather's point of view. I feel like the bell has been rung on the argument that she made, which is actually that incarceration at the scale that we have is not a bargain, whether it's $80 billion or $37 billion, and that it doesn't work. And there's scads of evidence that supports that. And there's a lot of evidence also that supports the notion that you can do different things. So in your own city where you and I live, Rockefeller, the Vera Institute just did an analysis of the Rockefeller drug law reforms. And one of the things that we showed, looking at thousands of cases, was that people who go into drug treatment had a recidivism rate 2 years after that of 36%, compared to those who had gone into a cohort that had gone into prison for it's the exact same matching cohort, and their recidivism rate after the same period upon being released was 54%. So in that circumstance, treatment works. And there's a lot of literature. The National Academy of Sciences had a great deal to say. We have, one of the leaders of it here, and Bruce Western, about the extent to which incarceration doesn't work. So I wanted to say that because it's actually much less of a debate than Heather might sort of set it out to be, as clean as it looks and the way she describes it. However, to go to your question about the media, I do think that there's an increasing body of journalistic enterprise, and I named some of them that are peering into this abyss of the criminal justice system as we've constructed it over the past 4 decades, and are trying to come to terms with the debate that has persisted for years, which is, is what we're doing, incarcerating people at a very high rate, arresting at a high rate, actually working, and sort of unpacking that question. And there's a lot of intelligent journalism that's going on to unpack that and to understand cost well beyond fiscal cost, but cost to communities and to individuals and to those who are actually actors in the justice system.
Cost and long-term marginalization of the people.
So all of that.
Productivity loss, everything.
So there's much more of that than there was before, and that's a good thing. And then there's also a fair amount of, still, if it bleeds, it leads shitty journalism that goes on, and you can see it in the, evening news. I get on a daily basis a digital download from something called DNA Info, which is this sort of neighborhood journalism enterprise. And I was thinking as I came here, I was like, well, let me just look and see what some of the headlines were for the past 2 weeks. And so, basically what it does is for particular neighborhoods is it provides, information. An ice cream store opens here, but almost always it's talking about crime. Police shoot man in Crown Heights, NYPD says. Breaking news. 2 men shot in Bed-Stuy subway station. Crime blotter. Woman finds guns and bullets in closet while packing to move. Video. Suspect sought on Nostrand Avenue shop burglaries, police say. I mean, is this news? And that was all in the span of 1 week. So there's still a ton of that, and it's still operating in a digital world. And it's still, I think, in New York, ends up affecting a lot of the coverage that we see from the tabloids and others. So I would sort of challenge the notion of the media as a monolith. I think there's a much better mass of smart, substantive inquiry that we're seeing, and then a lot of the same old stuff that we have seen before. And whether it's DNA Info or whether it's the New York tabloids, you can look at those things and see that a lot hasn't changed.
So I'm interested to hear from Bill and Brent, your sort of long-time traditional media guys, although the Marshall Project, I realize, is not as traditional as the New York Times. But what do you what are journalists getting right? What are they getting wrong in this new moment about the criminal justice system?
What traditionally, just to overgeneralize, traditionally journalists have covered crime. They haven't covered criminal justice very much. And that was true of the New York Times when I was running it. We didn't have anybody assigned to cover prisons, which now seems like a remarkable oversight. We covered the police department, but mostly we had somebody stationed at the police station to monitor crime. We would cover a really good trial, interesting trial, so we occasionally paid attention to the courts. By and large, we didn't cover the criminal justice system, and that's true of the high end of journalism as well as the low end. What's happened this year that really is new is that a lot of people are attempting to write about the system itself, about policing, strategies for policing, broken windows and things like that, about recidivism and what the causes of it are, about the brutality of life in prison and all of those things. And Nick's absolutely right that there's journalism and there's journalism. There's the New York Times reporting on Rikers. There's what Julie Brown has done at the Miami Herald, or Pam Koloff at the Texas Monthly, or Jen Gonerman in the New Yorker, which is very much high-end, very in-depth reporting. And then there are a lot of places, most obviously the tabloids and the evening news programs, where it still leads if it bleeds. What we're not very good at, well, first of all, as a general rule, journalism is not great at nuance. So nuance gets lost in a lot of these stories, even some of the good ones. But probably the main thing is we're much better at telling you what's going wrong than we are at telling you what's going right. We tend to recoil instinctively from what's called solutions journalism, where you write about the people who figured out how to make a reentry program work, or people who figured out how to curtail rape in prison. And it's something that we're belatedly at the Marshall Project setting out to do. But that's been the sort of traditional mandate for investigative journalism, is you shine a bright light on the things that are going wrong and leave it to people, to advocates and policymakers to solve it, and editorial writers like Brent to, egg them on.
Well, Brent, what do you think? You're one of our stalwarts, 25 years on the editorial board. What are folks getting right? What are they getting wrong?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because part of writing editorials is certitude. To go into a problem, weigh the evidence, get a central tendency, and push an idea. Among us, we concluded several years ago that, and with Bernard Harcourt at the University of Chicago, we concluded.
He's at Columbia now, by the way.
Oh, he moved, okay.
Closer to you.
Well, no accounting for taste. But I went to Chicago, so I'll take that back. Withdrawn, as they say in court. We've concluded that broken windows, zero tolerance policing.
They're different.
I know. Well, they're different and they're the same. And
Broken windows involves a discretion. It should.
okay, they're different and they're the same. And I use them almost interchangeably in my columns and editorials. And I know some people object, but here we go. I think the sense of putting as many people as possible into the system for minor, petty crimes has exacted not just an economic cost, a huge social cost. A few years ago in New York, we were up to 50,000 people for low-level marijuana arrests. And when you look at that, the internal numbers of that, huge numbers of these people had no prior offenses. And then we still have leftover lawsuits in which the police were stopping people and actually breaking the law with illegal searches or saying to them, take out this. They had people who had legal amounts of marijuana in their pockets, take it out. And now you've taken it out. Now it's in plain public view. Now you've broken the law. So basically, we concluded that that was a mess. And they're taking, you can see the marijuana statistics going down in New York. But the question is, how do we come to a point in the society where it became socially acceptable to railroad people in the jail for minor crimes by the tens of thousands? And the cost of imprisonment costs, 43, 60, 80, whatever it was. If we go back and do a real study of what we gained in New York out of the Rockefeller drug laws, I'm talking about lifetime incapacitation of individuals, many of whom were arrested, put in jail for lengthy sentences for first-time drug offenses. So what is the media doing right and wrong? I'm trying to answer your question. When people say the media oftentimes, they often assume that this is a creature that exists outside time and space and outside Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. In fact, people who run newspapers, who write these things, they actually live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood or not Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and they are subject to the same kinds of hysterias and the same kinds of misjudgments that the larger population is too. So if you go through stories in the various ways of crime and the various ways of incarceration, you'll find the same kinds of fallacies repeated in news stories that we now recognize were mistaken policy in the past. And we're at a moment now, a kind of, you might say, a golden moment. And I know that we have for some people, this is a Pollyanna moment, where they're thinking, perhaps we can close prisons and everything will be fine and we can hold our hands and sing Kumbaya. But I don't think that many tough-minded people think that, or many smart people think that. I think people are drawing back and saying, this system engaged so many people for so many minor crimes, kept them out of college, kept them out of jobs, kept them out of public housing, kept them out of apartments, kept them out of all kinds of things. And God bless the Koch brothers. You may not agree with everything they do, but the Koch Industries employs 60,000 people. And when the Koch said, you can come and apply for a job at our company, the felony question is no longer on the application. They were getting to the heart of something there, because they understand the what you call, I guess, the collateral damage to communities and individuals once you're permanently stigmatized and locked out of the system in every capacity. you know. They understand what that means. So your question, I mean, I think that the public changes its view of these things from time to time, and most often the media is sort of lagging slightly behind or with the central tendency of the public changing. So it's hard to see out when you're actually in part of the system.
Well, Heather, I want to return to you because you kind of jump-started us on this conversation, which I wanted to have, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are. You wanted to go there about what is the media in all of its many tentacle disaggregated form. What do you think it's getting right and wrong at this moment?
Well, I'm going to generalize and not make the finer distinctions that Nick did and just talk about what I see actually as the false media narratives that I think have been put out there overwhelmingly. One, that drug enforcement is what's driving the prison population and the criminal justice system generally. Two, that our system is just irrationally and arbitrarily draconian, that we are engaged in zero tolerance, that we throw people in jail just at a whim, and that the police are driven by race, and that there is a significant clash within minority communities between police and the community. And I would say that on the first point, that drug enforcement is what is driving the system, and that is the thesis of a reading that is in your annotated bibliography of Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. The New York Times, with all due respect, you were not there any longer, had a perfect example of this summer in July 2015 when President Obama paid a visit to a federal penitentiary in Oklahoma, the El Reno Correctional Facility. And the Times had this as their lead story. Obama himself said, these are guys who made mistakes not very different than the ones you and I made, referring to the waiting reporters. The Times said, there's not much difference. The line is very fine between a president and a prisoner, suggesting that all it takes is smoking marijuana and trying cocaine to end up in federal prison. And then 2 days before, President Obama addressed the NAACP meeting in Philadelphia and said, the real reason our prison population is so high is that we have locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders. That is the central conceit. I would say the press has completely fallen down on the job of fact-checking the president and itself. Drugs is not what has driven the prison population increase. To be sure, the incarceration rate has gone up a large amount, 400% since the late 1970s. What has driven the increase overwhelmingly is violent crime. The more violent crime has been prosecuted and the sentences have gotten longer. Since '99, the entire increase in the population was driven by violent crime. The decade of the 1990s, 53% of the increase was violent crime. And in the 1980s, when the prison population was rising the fastest, 36% of the increase was from violent crime, 33% was from drugs.
Can I interrupt just to offer two statistics? I said before, the press has a lot of trouble with nuance, and this is a nuance that sometimes gets lost in the debate. But it is true that fewer than 20% of the people who are incarcerated in our prisons are there for drug offenses.
16% in state.
Yeah, okay. But in federal prisons, it's nearly half are there for drug offenses. And what Obama was talking about was federal prisoners.
He didn't couch it that way. He said what's driving our prison population at the NAACP, he was speaking generally. And he was also wrong about the federal population. It's true. The federal population is 50% drug crimes. The federal prison population is 13% of the nation's incarcerated population. In 2014, according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, less than 1% of federal drug prisoners were convicted for possession. It was overwhelmingly for trafficking, and most of those 1% possession convictions in the federal system were plea bargained down from a trafficking offense. So I say the press has gotten the drug story wrong. They're also wrong, in my opinion, by saying that this is a system that is, at a drop of a hat, swooping people up and throwing them in prison. Every year, a third of felony convictions go to prison. Another third get community supervision, and another third go to jail. People are given opportunity after opportunity in the community for parole, probation. When you look at the records of people in prison, 50% have 5 or more convictions. This is, as I say, you have to work hard to get in prison. And the third thing I would quickly I know I'm taking a lot of time, there is a massive amount of support that I have found in minority communities for policing and for broken windows policing. I have not been to a police community meeting in South Central Los Angeles, in Harlem, in South Bronx, where I haven't heard variants of the following questions. We want the dealers off the street. You arrest them and they're back the next day. There's kids smoking in my lobby. I'm scared to get my mail. There's kids hanging out of the club on the corner smoking marijuana at 3 a.m. Why can't you arrest them? The police cannot respond to those heartfelt requests for broken windows policing. That's not to say they have to make an arrest. It is not zero tolerance. They can use discretion, give somebody a warning, pour out the liquor. You don't have to arrest somebody. Broken windows is conceptually completely different than some kind of zero tolerance. But the demand for quality of life enforcement is coming from the minority community. They want public order. And that, I don't think, is getting conveyed by the press.
I would say
Go ahead.
a few things. Let us say that, stipulate that, in fact, when we had sort of either ratcheting up mandatory minimums in the 80s, that had huge support from the black community. It had huge support from the black middle class, and to some extent the black elites, because they were black middle class, they're proximate to crime, and they were victims of it. And in fact, what's happened, and that was reflected in the NAACP's, I think, hesitancy for a long time to get involved in the project of criminal justice reform. Because for black middle class people, the sort of narrative of American life was, if you keep your nose clean, if you're sort of better than everyone else, then you deserve full citizenship. And sort of engaging the apparatus of the black middle class on behalf of those people was sort of not in the political mission of the black middle class at that time. What changed that, and now that's a platform in the NAACP, what changed that is 100 people in their circle found out that their kid was stopped for possession on the Jersey Turnpike, and end up going to jail under a mandatory minimum, a Rockefeller-type drug law. And the sort of horror of watching actually middle-class black kids' lives being wiped away, eradicated in that way, I think has animated them. Now, on your question on your issue of people in South Central and in some parts of the Bronx, yes, people deserve to have decent policing. People deserve to have a modicum of safety in their homes and in their streets. But what has undermined support for that in New York City, in Brownsville, for example, not long ago we had a kid who was a legal clerk with no record who'd been stopped and frisked by the cops 40 times on the way to work. That's undermined support for that. I think that despite the Bloomberg administration, I agree with Bloomberg on many, many things during his time in office, and we did have an issue of this. I think that stop and frisk in New York was overwhelmingly an unconstitutional program. I think it was statistically proven to be so. And I think the public has passed judgment on that. You know, and to use your word, the bell is rung on that one. And also with frisks going down, you know, initially they were telling us that if frisks go down, you're going to be swept. You're not going to be able to live in your home. That really hasn't happened. You know, so people do deserve safety, but they deserve safety, but they deserve to be treated decently. And
Absolutely.
if they're not treated decently, they're not going to have respect for the police. They're not going to countenance. They're not going to trust them. We had a guy just the other day say in the paper, you know, with the experience I've had with cops, even when I need them, I don't call them anymore. So that is itself is sort of undermining public safety.
I probably shouldn't respond because I know that.
Let me give Jim a chance. Let me give Jim a chance, and then I want to raise another question.
So this discussion raised another issue, and I wanted to go back to the first question of the media and whether what it gets right or wrong. And for me, it's a question of sort of how wide the lens is. As we were discussing stop and frisk or zero tolerance, and some will disaggregate them, and some folks will conflate the two terms. Not stop and frisk, rather, but broken windows. Mm-hmm. My trouble, actually, with how we talk about broken windows is that, as originally conceived, it actually started with the windows. And one of the things that I would commend to folks that are focusing on criminal justice reform is a book by David Sloan Wilson called The Neighborhood Project. You may be familiar with it. He is actually an evolutionary biologist working at SUNY Binghamton. And he decided to actually make a contribution within his community to get out of the gown and into the town, and focused on different sorts of indicia of pro-social behavior. And criminality is at one spectrum of a variety of social behaviors. And what he saw was that in neighborhoods where actually there was attention to the windows and were attention to a lot of the other issues, the antisocial behavior that ranged from littering to then criminality actually was decreased. So to the extent that when I think about true broken windows, it actually doesn't start with the law enforcement officer's engagement with someone who may or may not be committing a crime and might have at least reasonable suspicion that there's a crime. But it actually starts much earlier in the sorts of engagement. And I've discussed this with senior law enforcement leaders who have been resistant to the idea of, say, incorporating into their data collection system measures of effectiveness or community engagement that don't start with simply the fact of an arrest or a stop, but actually start with earlier forms of engagement. Because when you do that, a couple of different things happen. Going to Brent's point about the people who want the police but no longer call them, because of the nature of the interaction, law enforcement actually loses a lot of valuable data. Former Police Commissioner Ramsey in Philadelphia used to say that because of the nature of their engagement, they were able to solve some of the low-level crimes for sure, but the complicated homicides that actually involved developing witnesses, gathering evidence, they became much more difficult because there wasn't this relationship between law enforcement and the community that they're sworn to serve. Which is why I feel that when the press talks about this, their lens is often too narrow, and it only starts with the fact of arrest, non-arrest, and doesn't look at the nature of engagement, which is actually measurable and makes a difference, as we found in Camden, New Jersey, much earlier than the process. And lack of nuance matters. And just touching briefly on the community issue, in New Jersey, I've been working with others who have set up community forums where essentially what we do is borrow a page from the deliberative democracy movement. We provide people with some basic facts about issues that we might discuss, like the pro or con body cams or the impact of body cams, the impact of certain administrative practices in school that lead to a higher incidence of black and brown kids going to the schools. And in these conversations, you will have law enforcement sitting down side by side from people who may have been protesting against them on the street. And the issues that are raised are often two. As one person said in our very first meeting, we want protection, not persecution. And that is a very raw and blunt way to state it. But it begs for a different sort of engagement between communities and the police, so that we are actually very smart about who we're prosecuting, and we're smart about how we intervene so that prosecution doesn't become necessary. Because once they go to, and it's not really a lifetime achievement award, very often for many people it's a finishing school. And at least some of the people that I prosecuted, it wasn't like they had multiple rap sheets. They engaged in sometimes very, very serious crimes. May have been the first time they got caught. But if they ended up being in a space where they were in my crosshairs, they were actually going to go away for a long time. And the thrust of our policy, and the last piece that I was talking about, is how we even set this up. The media, it is often the case that discussions are not unlike discussions where we have here, where it's, okay, this is the right's perspective, this is the left perspective. And then sometimes there's a coin flip, and there's a discussion of this is what the person on the left has said, and this is what the person on the right said, and everyone's singing from a hymnal that they've been holding for 30 years, as opposed to even asking, are we even asking the right questions? Is the left asking the right questions? Is the right asking the right questions? And, is the solution, am I for it because it's right or left, or is it something that works? And to the extent that the discussion doesn't get to that point, then for those of us who end up, I'm on the Brennan Center board, but I'm also, some people look at me when I go to these community meetings and say, like, this guy's a cop. There is actually a sweet spot for some of these things. They may come at them from different ways, but there's a sweet spot, and that's often lost in the media.
Yeah, all right.
Can I make one plea, a very short plea,
Yeah.
too? That when we use the word crime, for example, what I found in my work is that encounters with police officers can begin very, very early for black and brown kids. And I had an editorial just last week about a case where 2 third graders were put in handcuffs for acting out in class. And the Justice Department has come into the school system and said, there's some constitutional problems here. We've seen in the last 20 years, right, in the last 10 in particular, an actual sort of bleeding down of criminalizing entire communities through stop and frisk, and sort of mass arrests and marijuana arrests, and actually criminalizing children in school for adolescent behavior that is pretty much ordinary. And I think we saw that a little bit in the South Carolina case of the girl being body slammed. So when I think of this, I think of it as bleeding all the way down from my former teenager, from my son who's 30, being stopped for driving while black, all the way down to children in primary school.
Can I respond? I just, that whether we need law enforcement in schools is a question I'm agnostic about, but I would push back a little bit against Brent's phrase of criminalizing the entire community, that I don't think that's what the... Okay, but I'm not...
That's the point I brought up.
Okay. The police are not criminalizing the entire community. I would completely agree with Brent and Jim that the police have to treat everybody with courtesy and respect. And the NYPD, I'm sure like every other police department, they can be so offensive in their interaction with civilians, peremptory, full of themselves, just blunt. That needs to be worked on incessantly. But it is not the police that are criminalizing communities. Policing today is data-driven. The police go where people are being victimized. You can go to the famous CompStat meetings in the New York Police Department, these weekly crime analysis meetings where precinct commanders are grilled ruthlessly about whether they have a plan to keep their communities safe. Race never comes up
And often that turned out to
once.
be falsifying statistics.
That's not true.
It absolutely is true. Cop after cop has said this. Basically, I think the
Can I
CompStat
finish?
idea initially was a great idea, but I think the tail began to wag the dog, and people began to lie about what they saw. They began to downrate crimes from larceny to misdemeanors. They began to do all kinds of things, and I think that the public record is open on that. It's really open.
Heather, one more minute, and I want to move us on to another topic.
CompStat is about where victims are happening. It says nothing about race. And from my perspective, the solution to our policing problem is to bring the black crime problem down. You mentioned Brownsville. The New York Times did a whole series on Brownsville stop, question, and frisks, 73rd Precinct. It was never brought out that the per capita shooting rate in Brownsville is 81 times higher than that in Bay Ridge. The stop rate in Brownsville is only, pedestrian stops, it's only 15 times higher. Every time there's a shooting, the police are going to flood that neighborhood looking to make stops to avert a retaliatory shooting. With a crime disparity of that magnitude, the people, the law-abiding residents of Brownsville face an 81 times higher risk of getting shot. That is a tale of two cities that we should be worrying about, and the police are trying to respond to. As long as kids are being raised without paternal control, the police are the second best solution to maintaining order. And I wish that wasn't needed, but it is at the moment.
Probability
I don't think we
statistics
can
don't
move on yet.
license you to seize people's rights.
No, absolutely. The stops have to be
I mean,
constitutional.
there's a different thing between sort of, the Bayesian probability and the probability that this individual's a criminal.
They need reasonable
And
suspicion for each
most
one.
often, race is a proxy for suspicion.
Well, I think that some of the evidence that was presented in the Terry stop and frisk challenge in New York City did show that police stop and frisks were not well correlated with crime rates, where the CompStat is supposed to do that, but the stop and frisk data did not show that. But it was better correlated with race.
With being black and Hispanic,
So
wherever you were.
Jeffrey Fagan's model was completely clueless about how policing works. He used homicide data that was a month old to try to predict policing today. That is absurd. The NYPD today is using minute-by-minute crime data. So he is not using crime as a benchmark. He used a population benchmark and plugged in crime in a way that was completely inadequate to how the police make their deployments.
So Jeffrey Fagan was the expert witness for the
Can you produce
challengers.
the data the way you'd like to see it?
This is not the place because we don't have the data here. We don't have Jeff Fagan here. But there's a real question about what's driving it. But I take Heather's point, which is an important one, and a question about nuance, which is that there is a story, that there are narratives that clearly have a lot of truth behind them, of both over-intrusive, overly violent, over-policing based on race, and also insufficient policing, also based on race. So Gigliovi's book, Ghettocide, which depicts the funding and investigation of homicides in the almost entirely black and brown South Central LA, is sort of the flip side of Black Lives Matter too. And there's no question that historically, poor minority communities have been both under and over policed in various ways. And this is one of the nuances. It's hard to tell these narratives in a nuanced way. And you end up with only the over-policing story, only the under-policing story. And it's hard to see that those stories are like, the DNA of a the double helix. I'm not even going to go with that metaphor, but that, that they exist simultaneously and are part of the same history. And it's very hard to get these stories out, which is what I want to, my last question before I open this up to the public is to think about what the challenges are, both for our media players and for our policy players, who are trying to talk about criminal justice issues today in all their complexity, and what makes it hard. What are the hardest challenges to moving this conversation forward? I mean, Bill, you already raised the problem of nuance, which I'm sort of underscoring here. That's one problem of how you tell a nuanced story. And Brent, I'm sure this is an issue when you write, an op-ed. How do you tell a story that is both nuanced but also that moves the ball forward in the direction that you think it should go? Same thing for you policy players. There's also a big problem about institutions that are hard to get inside of, whether it's police departments or prisons or prosecutors' offices, where it's hard for us to see inside these black box institutions. And there's the problem that Jim raised about sort of people singing from their hymn books, not closed institutions, but maybe closed minds. Everybody thinks they know what the narrative should be before you're even, so how do you get people to rethink the question? So I just want to open this up. Any of you, maybe start with you, Bill, about what are the biggest challenges today?
Well, I'll give you a couple of them. One of them is, we, including I, have been talking about the growth in serious coverage of the criminal justice system. But that's mostly at the national level. There are, as I mentioned, Miami. There are a few other local, regional papers that have done a good job. But for the most part, local papers don't have the resources to devote, or don't choose to devote the resources to covering their systems. And overwhelmingly, criminal justice in America is practiced at the local level. It's the federal system, as Heather pointed out, is, I think it's about 10% of the total incarceration rate. Most people are in state prisons and county jails, and they're not getting covered except sporadically, even during this sort of golden age of coverage. So that's one thing that I think is a challenge for journalism. Another is that journalists, maybe Americans in general, have short attention spans. When Neil Barsky started the Marshall Project, we first began talking about it at the beginning of last year. The idea was, he said, to create a sense of urgency about the state of the criminal justice system and to force it into the debates. Little did we suspect that 15 months later, candidates would be giving speeches about criminal justice reform, leading candidates, and there would be not sufficiently, but a significant debate. I just worry that that's a bit of a bubble, and I think what Neil set out for us to do, to stimulate this debate and force a sense of public concern, is going to be more important in a year or two than it is now, because that's when everybody else is going to be distracted by the bright, shiny object that distracts not only journalists, but people who donate money to nonprofit organizations, people who invest in model programs of reform.
Nick, let me turn to you. You run a policy shop. What do you think the biggest challenges are to moving the ball forward and having impact and conversation and changing the public discourse around criminal justice policy?
Well, I think I'm just going to repeat what others say here, is that it's difficult to tackle the nuance. This is such a thicket of issues. Whether you're focused on policing, so the debate that we all sort of tried to restrain ourselves to not fall into around policing, or the bigger conversation around mass incarceration. I mentioned a while ago that the National Academy of Sciences produced a major 450-page report on the causes and consequences of mass incarceration. It's 450. It's a massive undertaking, and we're dealing with system of such complexity with so many different actors and stakeholders, whether it's at the local or state level, and we know so little about it because it has been largely ignored by the media and by the general public for 40 years. It has been invisible. Brent talked a little bit about how the NAA or middle-class African Americans wouldn't touch the issue, along with many other folks. Good progressives wouldn't touch the issue either. So we have this huge hangover to tackle, which is that there's very little public understanding. There's very little sort of sophisticated media understanding to unpack and understand. We have this bubble moment when all of a sudden everyone seems, is engaged. And in order to have a more sophisticated understanding so that we can make smarter policy decisions, which would require an engaged, smartened public, it's something that has to persist for decades. I mean, I think so. That strikes me as the most profound challenge that we're confronting, which is that at some point, I think there will be a new it issue. But my optimism is that, so I'll just use a tiny example. So why did Mark Zuckerberg visit San Quentin? Not because he woke up someday and was and thought to himself, this issue is one I've been meaning to work on, and now I've got time. I'm going to go to San Quentin. So he went and he visited because he, like many of us, have been bombarded by data and argument and been exposed to a deeply complicated circumstance that he wanted to better understand. And my hope is that there are many Mark Zuckerbergs or many Neil Barskys or many others who are getting into this issue right now that will, carry that with them in how they think and how they vote or how they use their philanthropic dollars or whatever it might be, so that we can, even if the momentary bubble of interest, deflates a bit, there will still be, the institutions, Marshall Project or others, and a still curious public that can do the very hard work that we need to do over the next few decades, which is to really drive to the fore what the solutions are and to figure out how to engage. We have again, just to sum up, I think we have a very ignorant population around these issues, and that needs to be cured, and it won't happen in the 18 months of sort of exuberance that we've experienced thus far.
Irrational or not exuberance, right? Isn't that the phrase they always use? Well, both Bill and Nick, your responses to the question about what are the most difficult questions raised what I really wanted to be my very last question to this panel before turning to the audience, which is this a bubble? How long is it going to last? Bill, you suggested, the 2016 elections are going to come along and they're going to distract us. There'll be a new it issue, says Nick, it's coming down the road. Who knows what it'll be? But, criminal justice will be displaced. Do the rest of you agree? Are we in a bubble that's going to burst? Is it going to burst soon? How big an opportunity do we have? Or is it already vanishing, as I've heard people say? I'd be curious to hear what the rest of you think about whether this moment is just a blip or a kind of a new normal that we'll have for a while.
Are you talking, just to clarify, you're talking about this as a media moment or as a policy moment,
or both? A moment of public questioning about criminal justice policy that may many people think, let's get to work, let's try to change some things because there's an appetite for criticism of these institutions that have gone in one direction and one direction only for the past 4 decades. Now there's a chance to rethink. Is this chance gonna, takes a while to make change. It doesn't happen overnight. Is this moment here for a while, or is it a bubble, a passing fancy before we all turn to presidential sweepstakes, which we seem to already be turning to?
I'll take a stab at that. I think that we are in the midst of this perfect storm of heightened curiosity and attention. So you've got Black Lives Matter and, every candidate on the right or the left having something to say about mass incarceration, and a president who is clearly choosing to devote his remaining time in office to draw attention to this. And that's... I don't know whether we're at our peak, but I think we're probably close to the peak. But I would go back to what Brent said a moment ago and that I echoed, which is that that there is something durable at work here. So people are interested in the unicorn that Bill said we all discovered in D.C., which is that the right and left can work together on this issue in some regard, and that the Koch brothers match up with the ACLU. But that's been in existence for 10 or 15 years. It's been quiet, and it's been building, and it's been sustained. It hasn't reached sort of the, now I guess we're at the apogee of interest. But it's real. It's not make-believe, and I think that even if the level of attention de-intensifies, as it has to sometime soon, I think what underlies that is are very real dynamics that will continue to create interest. And as long as we have institutions like the Marshall Project, or again, a lot of the new digital news that are seeking to explore and understand and helping people to gain entry and figure this issue out, will be okay. But it gets to the question of really, are those models sustainable? In the absence of a Marshall Project or a Vice media, which are talking to a whole set of people that are not represented on this panel at all, how does the public gain access to a topic that is remote from them, that is behind gray walls? And then how can you actually intelligently pursue reform if you don't understand it or aren't exposed to it? So, my hope is that the models work, and that, that these efforts are indeed sustainable. But I'm optimistic that they will.
I would say one thing that could change, and first of all, I just completely agree with Nick about the complexity of the system. It is just mind-boggling, the detail of prosecutorial decisions, whether the arcane federal sentencing penalties or just what local DAs do. I mean, you say the public's ignorant. I think most of us are ignorant unless you've actually been a DA. I mean, who can possibly know the minutiae of bail decisions and charging decisions? It is a completely different world. I plead completely guilty to not knowing enough. It's just, I've never done that practice, and I think you have to experience it to really understand it. But somebody, I don't remember if it was Bill or Jim at the beginning, when talking about what are the background preconditions for this surge of interest, one of them was low crime. And there's no question the pendulum is swinging. We're going back to sort of the mid-1960s when we had the Presidential Commission on Criminal Justice that was also arguing for de-incarceration, alternatives to prison. Again, I'm all for alternatives. Prison is the worst solution, but unless we can come up with something that works better than policing and prison, that's what we've got. But the pendulum's swinging back. But crime this year is going up dramatically. The New York Times in September found that the 35 biggest cities, an increase of 19% in homicides. The blog 538 looked at the 60 largest cities, found a 16% increase in homicides. This is massive. If there had been a 16% drop in homicides, people would have been going around high-fiving themselves. So if crime continues to go up, and my hypothesis for it, which has been backed by others and hotly contested by others, but Comey, FBI Director Comey, has signed on to it, is that the police are backing off of discretionary proactive policing. They're still answering 911 calls, responding to crime victims after the fact, but the type of proactive policing that was key to the crime drop, after having been told that broken windows policing is racist, that pedestrian stops are racist, they're doing less of it, understandably, and that's how it should work. It's the police are political. They're backing off and crime is going up. If that continues, I think that the criminal justice conversation is going to change yet again.
There's no question that levels of crime determine what ideas can tolerably be discussed and entertained. There's absolutely no question about that. By the way, and just to plug, we had an editorial when Comey made that remark about the police backing off. And my headline was, political lies about Black Lives Matter. I commended you to go back and read it. But I think no one can predict where the debate is going to go. But one thing is going to happen. From now on, since everyone has 3 cell phones, acts in which police kill a civilian under questionable circumstances will be instantaneously known around the world. That part of the problem is with us for the duration. I mean, that part of the issue is with us from duration. And however that affects, the discourse, and it will. But from where I'm sitting, what I try to get people to understand, when they talk about crime, they're not talking about when a 17-year-old walks out and sticks up a bodega. What they need to be talking about are the precursors to all of that. And what we're going to need to be seeing in places like Brownsville and less and less in some places like the Bronx. How do we, as a society, get even 25% or 15% of those young Black and Hispanic men off of that first track that gets them their first arrest and those 3 days in jail, or maybe that period in the county jail? How do we do that? And to pay some real attention to that, because by the time he's been thrown out of school 4 times, by the time he's dropped out and not got that high school diploma, by the time he's got that record and can't get a job, and by the time he applies to the State University of New York and they ask him on the front of the application, do you have a conviction? And then they throw that application away. So basically, we've got to go back to the beginning and talk about how can we keep even 10, 15% of those people from doing that first crime and getting into the system. That's where crime prevention is, in my view, and that's where the discussion needs to go.
Fathers.
Last word before we open this up.
Couple of
To
things.
something that's been said.
All right.
Okay, well,
You can each have a minute, and I want to give the audience, if they've been patient,
Okay.
I want to give them a chance to ask
So
us
I'll
some
preempt
questions.
Jim and point out that the Brennan Center has a report out today, which I haven't read, so I can't vouch for its validity. But they looked at the 30 largest American cities, most recent monthly crime data, and they call into serious question whether crime is actually going up. Even the murder rate is going up in half of the cities, but not in the other half, although the murder rate's a pretty serious indicator. But, the point, though, is that whether or not the crime rate is going up, the fear of crime, I think, is growing up. I remember back when those 2 guys fled the prison in upstate New York, and the manhunt was on, sort of CNN 24/7. For days, and I know a lot of people who are reform advocates were terrified that those guys were going to do a home invasion and slaughter some family, and that would be the end of reform. I don't know how vulnerable or how fragile the kind of consensus that we need to do something is. The I guess optimistic view for people who advocate reform is that even if the federal government gives up on it, which may well happen, the most interesting stuff is going on in the states anyway, and a lot of states have done really interesting things, and that'll probably continue.
Including Texas, so it's not
Starting
just
with
your
Texas,
usual.
but Mississippi, Utah, Connecticut, Georgia.
Jim.
So one last thing, and it's related to how long this will persist, and that's the obstacles to reform and what might frustrate it. We haven't talked about this that much, but these are obviously very emotional debates. And the nature of the debate and how we conduct it often cuts off deeper thought. There are instantaneous reactions that slow us down. I know that because I experienced it even during this session. My tell is how high my sleeves have gone up. And pretty soon it'll look like I have a T-shirt on. But it was actually in response to something that Heather had pointed out, which raised both a process issue and a substantive issue. The process issue is what happens when we get triggered by certain statements. And Heather made a statement about towards the end of, I guess, your second to last intervention, when you mentioned that the phrase was something like, in the absence of paternal control, police need to step in.
Parental control.
Parental control. And then the next, in fact, the last thing, and this may have been formed why I remembered as paternal, you mentioned, you said the word fathers as a difference. And that's important because it triggered in me as kind of reaction to a strain of thought that one might say is, well, that's actually talking about a community and a culture and making a broad generalization, which stops my thinking at, oh my gosh, I've been offended. And we are so frequently trained to react to that first thing instead of saying, okay, well, what is it in there that I can use that's useful? Part of it is, for instance, one of the consequences of our law enforcement policy is that a tremendous number of parents are actually taken out of these communities. Or because they've been disabled by the consequences of some of our law enforcement decisions, they're not able to be the sorts of providers and community contributors that are necessary. So there's part of that, but we need to actually think more deeply about it. And my second the issue that I consider as an obstacle is our mindset around the role of law enforcement. And it's been raised by a couple of times as one of control, the idea of, and even stepping in as to substitute for parental control. What we ought to be moving towards is a place of moving from control. Some law enforcement folks would say we need to move from a posture of warriors to guardians. And what I have been working towards, and it's informed a lot by my work with large corporations, is to move from the idea of, say, a compliance system, and the criminal law is simply it's a community-based compliance system, to move from the notion of the control model to where you actually have engaged the community in the effort. But until we get that overall mental map of what law enforcement should be doing and get people like the group that I've been working with to articulate that, we are going to have, the system will function in accordance with our overarching mental map. And we may tweak it around the margins, but unless we're able to do that and really engage many communities in this process, this conversation will go above the radar, below the radar, but some of the practical effects that we see will continue to persist.
Can I just throw out an anecdote in response to Jim's excellent points? The police ideally are not oppressive control freaks. But there is a reality out there that sometimes they have to respond to. This June, I was in the 41st Precinct in the South Bronx. One woman spontaneously, an elderly woman spontaneously exclaimed, "How lovely when we see the police. They are my friends." That voice rarely gets covered in the media. What they were asking for was, A, they wanted a surveillance tower because of the shootings in their neighborhoods. There's no more sort of panopticon, Bernard Harcourt type of oppression than a surveillance tower. But they were also complaining, they said, there's crowds of teens hanging out on the corner, hundreds of them, beating each other up. They beat up on an 8-year-old girl the other day. Why can't you do something about that? That's what I'm talking about, where you have a breakdown of informal controls. And when that happens, what the police hear is requests for order, and they have to respond to that.
All right, I want to give the audience a chance to respond. Yes, you can push a button in front of you where it says push and hold it down, and your voice will be amplified. Speak into the microphone.
Like that?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question about a slice of this very complex ecosystem that has not been mentioned that I think is a very significant one and speaks directly to the fact that criminal justice in large measure, and a lot of what we're talking about, is a matter of social and economic justice. And then sidebar, I'm a graduate of this institution, taught at the Divinity School, and have done a lot of work around ethical investing over the years. And for the last year, I've been working with the Bay State Banner, which is Boston's black newspaper that just celebrated its 50th anniversary. And what I'm trying to do there is connect the community, not to the police and not to policymakers and not to the sort of law enforcement system, but rather, or housing experts, or any of the number of issues that are important to communities of color, but to capital markets. And the fact is that the primary beneficiaries of law enforcement or criminal justice in this country these days are private prisons or companies that are part of that ecosystem. And I wonder if any attention has been given to not only the massive sort of numbers of public dollars that are going into these private sector institutions, and it's not just the prisons themselves, it's the Sodexos, the telephone companies, the surveillance companies, the banks that do the financing. The American Friends Service Committee just came out a couple weeks ago with a list of the Dirty 13, the companies that are part of this prison industrial complex, and how, much like the boycott and sanctions and targeted investment movement that was used in the South African debate and certainly the fossil fuel debates today, you know, that mass incarceration is becoming a question that responsible investors are raising. So,
what's the question?
The question is, have you thought about both the privatization of the criminal justice system and how private dollars that are going into that might be leveraged toward jobs, not jails, or go into be used in ways that not only legitimize.
I'll try to answer that.
Okay.
I think it's very well understood at this point. By the way, the FTC, you talked about phone calls. The FTC promulgated new rules last week that drops the cost of inmate phone calls dramatically. I mean, historically, you had a situation where if you wanted to talk to your loved one behind bars, you had to choose between putting food on the table and making the call. You know, $14 for 3 minutes in some cases. So I think that people are beginning to understand, all sorts of regulators are beginning to understand that lots of industries were slicing off of prisons in a way that was harmful to society as a whole, and in some cases unconstitutional. So these issues are being dealt with slowly. I think also people are coming back to this following point. When Congress, I guess in '96, decided that prison inmates would no longer be eligible for Pell Grants, it was put in the context of, we don't want to lavish goods on these people who commit crimes. And we want to keep them, from, out of the public largesse. It'll be a while before we get back to that point, but it's becoming more and more understood that the real problem with a lot of people who are in jail is that they have no education. And Boston University has a great program, the prison education program, and I wrote one column about it some time back, and I asked them for some numbers, and their recidivism rates were in the single digits. And people from like these Bay State and some serious jails. I mean, they didn't have there was not a huge end. But I asked one of the persons, I said, what do you think stops all these people from going back to jail? Is it sort of job preparation? And he said, no. He said, after they get a college degree, they become slightly more self-reflective.
Thank you. I want to we have some other people who'd like to ask questions. Bruce, you were next.
Yeah.
Bruce Western from Kennedy School of Government. It's not working here. Let me give you this, Bruce.
Oh, it is.
If you hold, you have to keep holding it.
Okay. So two questions. I'll try and ask them quickly. I was struck by Bill Keller's observation that until recently we just haven't had that much coverage of the system itself, and this is one of the great contributions in the Marshall Project. And it seems to me often what we're talking about as a policy matter is the everyday operations of police or corrections. And in a sense, that's not news in the eventful sense, but there's a news story there in the sense of informing the public. And I tend to see the best reporting on the everyday operations of police and corrections and so on in very careful long-form journalism. But the media seems to be becoming shorter and shorter. And so there seems to be some tension between what we want to know and how it's normally packaged and how the media is developing. And I sort of worry about that a bit, and I'm interested in the panel's reaction to that. The second question, very quickly, and we've touched on it and talked around it, is the problem of violence. And it seems I wonder if we're trapped into one of two narratives. One in which we're really talking about stranger victimization in street crime, and so much of violence does not look like that. And yet, in political talk, that's often how it's discussed. And then the alternative narrative is kind of not to talk about it at all. And it seems to me that, particularly in very poor communities, violence is an enormously salient social problem. But it's happening among people who know each other, often family members or adolescents, and it's happening in a social context in which there's a whole accumulation of social problems that are related to poverty that also don't get reported on very much. And media narratives about violence tend to be very, very thin. So the second question for the panel is, as a policy matter, as we're sort of considering this transitional moment, how important is the problem of violence, or are we just talking about dialing back the system to 1972 or something like that? Or should we be thinking about an alternative criminal justice paradigm that deals with the problem of violence in its social context of poverty in a different way? I'm not sure we're quite having that debate yet.
Two great questions. The withering of long-form journalism. Anyone? Bill?
City Journal just published, they've published 10,000 word articles. My last one was 10,000, so read City Journal. We're like the last ones out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the
It is a
existential
real
questions
problem.
of what's going on in media these days. And, the pieces, the demand not only for shorter pieces to correspond to the short attention spans of readers, but shorter pieces because you have to have more of them, because that's, that's how clickbait works. The only guarantee that you'll get a lot of clicks is if you put out a lot of stuff. But, I can always find a silver lining in any cloud. And there are actually some quite good online long-form journalism startups. Whether they prosper or not, I don't know, but Huffington Post has one called Highline. There's a place called Long Reads. Mike.com takes very long pieces. Matter does an extraordinarily good job with long-form journalism, beautifully illustrated. So, there are people who are making at least small bets that this is something that for which there's an appetite.
This may seem oblique to your question, but recently, several weeks ago, the Supreme Court had a fair housing ruling in which Kennedy shocked a lot of do-gooders and nonprofit developers by saying the Fair Housing Act requires them to affirmatively further fair housing, and semicolon, and that means stop building all this affordable housing in ghettos. One of the problems, and I've been doing a series of editorials in the last several months on the Mount Laurel housing decision in New Jersey, which is, very salient. In fact, the state Supreme Court said that towns had a constitutional responsibility to allow zoning for affordable housing for low, moderate income people as a way of diluting poverty. And I don't know if you know Doug Massey, who's at Princeton, did his book on the Mount Laurel decision called Climbing Mount Laurel. It's very interesting and very hopeful in terms of what happened to the families that were historically trapped in Camden by redlining, zoning discrimination, and all those things. And I agree with you, violence is a problem in these places. Many people in these places suffer from PTSD, in perpetual life. So basically, people diluting poverty strategy, I think, in New Jersey is extremely promising, even though you were talking about 65,000 families in a state of 8 million people, but still, it's really interesting what's happening there. And the fact that the Supreme Court, said this out loud, many people were saying all along that the government, and he went back and actually went all the way back to the Kerner Commission report, which is where the text of the decision came from. So that's sort of a problem that we created this problem by intensifying poverty. I mean, we didn't create poverty, but we worsened the problem by intensifying poverty and concentrating it in places where the social problems become so overwhelming that we can't deal with them.
Can I speak to the violence question? Or
Speak to the violence question, and I think we can take one more question.
So, Bruce, I think you're talking about something that is the third rail of the reform movement, and that we actually we don't know how to unpack the issue of violence and how we should respond to it and what we actually mean by it when we say it and who the victims are and what those victims need. And, there's this old saying that goes around in criminal justice circles, which is we should distinguish between the people who we're mad at and those who we're afraid of. And the ones who we're afraid of, we're fine with prison. And the ones who we're mad at, we need to think of differently. And in doing that, President Obama did the same thing when he visited FCI Reno, El Reno. He said that he was talking about nonviolent drug offenders, as Heather pointed out and as the media then covered, as if we just dealt with that, we would then deal with mass incarceration. And obviously that, I think Heather's point is not true, but we're all complicit in that. Reformers all over the country, when they, those who pushed for Prop 47 reforms in California made that distinction very clearly because they knew where they could get the yes votes and where they couldn't. And if you made sure to tell the public that the reform was going to keep violent people in prison, then it was more likely to pass. And I think that it goes to, there are two fundamental problems. One is that we really can't reduce mass incarceration without dealing in a constructive, thoughtful way about what we mean when we say violent offender. What is the degree of conduct? What are the behaviors that we're talking about? How overbroad is that, is that label? It's a huge array of conduct. And then you have to ask the question, well, what is the right response? Is it a life sentence? Is it life without parole? How long should sentences be if we deem that incarceration is necessary? And it's one that people are just starting to tiptoe around. And so I think you're right to raise the question, but the level of unpacking, I think, is still quite insufficient, and I'm not entirely sure that we're all ready for it yet.
We have room for one last question. Yes?
Since 18 to 24-year-olds commit the majority of violent crime in America, why is there so little attention to this group and the issue of, as you cite, life without parole and excessive prison sentences? There's a lot of focus on juvenile, but why does this group get lost?
Why does the subject of juveniles get lost?
The subject of 18 to 24-year-olds and life without parole, you know, and especially with the issue now of brain science, proving they're not adult brains until they're age 25, and the Miller case. Why has this group, though, not been focused on, you think?
The research on the 18 to 21 or 24-year-olds is relatively new. The media are reactive, not proactive. There are a few places. I mean, Connecticut, the governor of Connecticut has proposed to raise the age to 21, drawing on some of that science. And we've written about the science on the Marshall Project, but the Marshall Project is obviously not, mass media yet. But I think it takes a while for some new. I mean, people are still dealing with the fact that children under 18 are different from adults, and that's not always an easy sell. So raising it to 24 is going to take a while, I think, and I mean raising that as a front and center issue.
And it depends on which level you're looking at it. So within many of the states, people are focused on juvenile justice, and juvenile justice reform is a very significant component. And even when we are having these community engagement conversations, we don't view it as a success if we only have senior law enforcement, and it's usually only a basis for success, if we only have senior law enforcement and sort of the parents or grandparents or whatever. It's when you have young people dealing with law enforcement, and that being an area of positive change and enforcement and intervention before the crimes happen, which is very important to many of us.
Great. We are going to pick up this conversation tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Well, we hope we'll see a lot of you here then. For now, please join me in thanking this terrific panel for kicking off our conference.